Do you believe a single mistake can follow you for 5 years? The question didn't come from anyone else, it echoed inside William Carter's mind as he stood alone in his penthouse overlooking Manhattan, the city glowing beneath him like a promise he no longer trusted. His reflection stared back from the floor-to-ceiling glass, sharp suit, steady posture, everything exactly as the world expected from a billionaire who never lost control, except tonight. His hand trembled slightly as he held an old photograph, the edges worn, the image faded but unmistakable. A woman standing in sunlight, her expression calm, her eyes unshaken, Naomi Brooks, the one person he had spent 5 years trying to find and the one person who never wanted to be found. Outside, the distant hum of traffic blended with the low whistle of wind against the glass, but inside, the silence was louder, heavier, filled with something he couldn't buy, couldn't fix, couldn't outrun, regret. It hadn't started like this. Not 5 years ago. Back then everything had been simple, clean, controlled. A scandal broke inside his company, millions of dollars in missing data, a breach that threatened everything he had built, and her name surfaced too quickly, too conveniently. Naomi Brooks, one of the most trusted analysts on his team, the one who had never once asked for recognition, never once stepped out of line, and yet there she stood in his office that morning, accused, composed, her voice steady when she said, "You're making a mistake." But William didn't ask questions. Didn't pause, didn't look deeper, because the board was watching, the investors were waiting, and power demanded speed, not doubt. The decision came down with a single signature, precise, final, and just like that, she was gone, removed from the system, erased from the company, erased from his world, as if she had never existed. But what stayed with him wasn't the accusation, or the headlines, or even the silence that followed. It was her eyes, not angry, not desperate, just disappointed, like she had expected more from him, like she had believed he would choose truth over convenience. Years passed, the company grew, profits doubled. His name expanded across industries, but none of it settled the quiet weight that began to build somewhere deeper, something that surfaced late at night when the city slowed and the noise faded, something that whispered that the story he had accepted was incomplete. Then one night, buried in an archived server, forgotten in a thread no one had bothered to revisit, he found it, a message, time-stamped hours before her termination. Evidence that shifted everything, data logs, internal flags. Proof that the breach had been orchestrated, not by her, but by someone else, someone still inside his empire, someone he had continued to trust. The room had gone still when he read it, the glow of the screen reflecting in his eyes as the truth settled in, heavy and undeniable. And for the first time in years, William Carter didn't feel powerful, he felt wrong. That was the moment the search began, not for answers, but for her. Because fixing the truth on paper meant nothing if the person he had wronged was still out there carrying the consequences of his decision. 5 years, dozens of cities, private investigators, quiet inquiries, donations made just to trace footprints that never stayed long, every lead pointing to the same pattern. Naomi Brooks didn't stay anywhere long enough to be found. She moved like someone who had learned that being seen came with a cost, and yet tonight, standing there with the photo in his hand and the city beneath his feet, William realized something that unsettled him more than anything else. He hadn't just been searching for her, he had been searching for the moment he could face what he had done, because finding Naomi Brooks wouldn't be the end of his mistake, it would be the moment it finally demanded to be answered. The next morning, William Carter did something he had not done in years. He cancelled every meeting on his calendar, ignored the flood of messages from his assistants, and sat alone in his office with nothing but a legal pad and a name written at the top in steady, deliberate letters, Naomi Brooks. Sunlight stretched across the polished floor, catching the edges of glass and steel, but it felt colder than it should have, like the room itself was waiting for him to stop pretending that this could be solved the same way he solved everything else, with strategy and distance. He picked up a pen, then set it back down, because this was not a deal to negotiate, it was a mistake to confront, and for the first time in a long time, he did not know where to begin. His assistant knocked softly before stepping in, her voice careful. "Mr. Carter, the board is asking if you are still attending the 10 a.m. call," and he did not look up when he answered, "No." The word landed heavier than expected, like it carried something final, something that shifted the rhythm of everything around him. She hesitated, surprised, then added, "There are also questions about the Keller contract," and at that, William finally lifted his gaze, sharp, focused, because that name had started to surface more often since last night. Daniel Keller, one of his most trusted partners, a man whose reputation was built on precision and loyalty, the same Man whose access logs had appeared in that buried email thread, quiet evidence that had been ignored for years. Postpone it, William said, his voice even, controlled, but something underneath it had changed, something colder, more deliberate. I will handle Keller myself. His assistant nodded, though confusion flickered briefly across her face. Before she stepped out and closed the door behind her, the room fell silent again. And William leaned back in his chair, staring at the skyline. Replaying every detail he could remember, every moment he had dismissed, every conversation he had ended too quickly, because now, every one of them felt incomplete. Naomi had not argued that day, she had not raised her voice or tried to defend herself with urgency, she had simply stood there, calm in a way that had unsettled him even then, and said, "You already decided," and he had, long before she walked into that office. Long before he gave her the chance to speak, his jaw tightened. Slightly as the realization settled deeper, this had never been about evidence, it had been about convenience, about choosing the path that protected everything he had built without questioning who it might destroy. He stood abruptly, the chair sliding back with a soft scrape against the floor, and crossed the room to the window, pressing his hand lightly against the glass as if grounding himself in something real, something immediate, because for years, he had lived in a world where outcomes could be shaped, controlled, predicted, but this was different. This was a past decision that had already taken its course, already changed someone's life in ways he could not measure. His phone buzzed. On the desk behind him, persistent, insistent, but he did not turn around, not yet, because there was something else forming in his mind, something clearer now than it had been the night before, a pattern he could not ignore. Naomi had not disappeared randomly, she had moved with purpose, every trace of her tied to places that help people, clinics, shelters, community centers, not for attention, not for recognition, but because that was who she had always been, even when no one was watching. He exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest shifting into something sharper, more focused, and finally turned back, picking up his phone, scrolling through a list of contacts until he stopped on one name, Marcus Hale, a private investigator who specialized in finding people who did not want to be found. His thumb hovered for a moment, just a second, because he understood what this call meant. It meant he was no longer looking for closure. He was stepping into something that might cost him more than he expected, and then he pressed the call button. The line rang once, twice, before a steady voice answered, "Hale," and William did not hesitate this time. "I need you to find someone." There was a brief pause on the other end, then a simple response, "Name," and William looked down at the paper in front of him, at the letters he had written hours earlier, and said quietly, "Naomi Brooks." The words felt different now, heavier, real in a way they had not been before, and as the silence stretched between them for just a moment longer, William realized this search was no longer about correcting a mistake, it was about uncovering everything that mistake had set in motion, and somewhere in that realization, a question surfaced that he could not ignore, not anymore. What had Naomi Brooks lost the day he decided not to listen? Marcus Hale did not ask many questions on the first call, which was exactly why William had chosen him. But the silence on the other end stretched just long enough to carry weight, like the name alone had already told him this would not be a simple search. "How long has she been off the grid?" Hale finally asked, his voice steady, professional, and William glanced at the skyline again before answering. 5 years. There was a pause, a quiet exhale. Then Hale replied, "That is not a search, Mr. Carter, that is a disappearance," and the distinction landed heavier than William expected, because it meant Naomi had not just left, she had chosen to vanish. By the end of the call, Hale had only one instruction: "Send me everything you have," and for the first time, William realized how little that actually was: a photograph, a few archived records, and a memory that felt less reliable the more he examined it. The day moved slowly after that, not with the usual rhythm of decisions and outcomes, but with a strange kind of waiting, the kind that made every minute feel intentional, like something was shifting beneath the surface that he could not yet see. By late afternoon, the first update came through, not a breakthrough, just fragments: a clinic in Detroit where someone matching Naomi's description had volunteered 3 years ago, a community center in St. Louis where a woman with her name had declined to give identification, a pattern that repeated across states, always the same, always temporary, always just enough to confirm she had been there and then gone. William studied the notes on his screen, the locations forming a quiet map of movement that did not follow logic or convenience, but something else, something personal, because each place was tied to people who needed help, people who had nothing to offer in return, and that realization settled into him with a quiet certainty. Naomi had not been running from the world, she had been moving toward it, just not toward him. He leaned back slightly, his fingers pressing together. As he thought through it, because there was intention in this, discipline, a pattern that required awareness, and that meant she was not just avoiding being found, she was controlling how she appeared, when she appeared, and to whom. His phone buzzed again, another message from Hale, this time shorter, more direct. I found something you need to see, and attached was a single image, grainy, taken from a distance. A woman standing outside what looked like a modest building, a hand-painted sign above the door reading Free Community Kitchen, her sleeves rolled up, her posture familiar in a way that made something tighten in his chest. William stared at the screen longer than he intended, because even through the low quality, even through the years, he recognized her, not just her face, but the way she carried herself, steady, focused, present, as if nothing in the world could distract her from what mattered in that moment. There was no hesitation this time. He stood, grabbed his coat, and moved toward the door with a purpose that had been missing for years, because for the first time, Naomi was no longer an idea, no longer a question. She was real again, somewhere out there, within reach. But just as his hand touched the door handle, another message came through, stopping him, pulling his attention back to the screen. This one different, marked urgent, and when he opened it, the words were simple but unsettling. You are not the only one looking for her, Williams. Expression shifted, the room suddenly feeling smaller, the quiet heavier, because that meant something he had not considered until now. Naomi's disappearance had not been just about him, and if someone else was searching for her, someone who had reason to keep the past buried, then this was no longer just a search for forgiveness, it was a race against a truth that someone else might not want uncovered. William did not leave the office right away, even though every instinct told him to move, to get on a plane, to close the distance between himself and the only real lead he had in 5 years, because the message from Marcus Hale lingered in his mind with a weight he could not ignore. You are not the only one looking for her, and that changed everything. He turned slowly back toward his desk, the city stretching behind him like a backdrop that suddenly felt irrelevant, because this was no longer just about regret or redemption, it was about timing, about who would reach her first and why. His phone was still in his hand when he dialed Hale again. The line connecting almost immediately this time. Explain that message, William said, his voice low but precise, and there was no hesitation in Hale's reply. Someone has been asking about her in the same places I have, asking the same questions, but they are not leaving a trail, they are cleaning one. William's jaw tightened slightly. Who? And Hale paused, just long enough to suggest uncertainty. I do not have a name yet, but I have a pattern. They show up after she leaves, they talk to the same people, and then those people suddenly do not remember much. The implication settled into the space between them without needing to be said. This was not coincidence, this was intent. William walked slowly back toward the window, his reflection faint against the glass as he processed it, because there were not many people who had both the reason and the resources to track Naomi like this, and fewer still who would benefit from keeping her hidden, or worse, from controlling what she might reveal. One name surfaced immediately, uninvited but undeniable. Daniel Keller, the same man whose access logs had been buried in that forgotten thread, the same man who had stood beside him in boardrooms for years, earning trust one calculated move at a time. Keep digging, William said quietly, and send me everything you find on anyone connected to those inquiries. Hale responded with a simple, understood, before the line went dead, leaving William alone again with the weight of a situation that was no longer contained to the past. He turned back to his desk, opened his laptop, and pulled up the Keller contract that had been waiting all morning. The numbers, the clauses, the polished language of partnership that now read differently, colder, more deliberate, as if every line hid something just beneath the surface. His eyes moved quickly across the document, but his mind was somewhere else, replaying years of interactions, every deal Keller had pushed, every decision that had seemed efficient at the time, and now, one by one, those moments began to shift, to take on a different meaning, as if he had been looking at the same picture from the wrong angle all along. The realization did not come as a shock, it came as a quiet certainty, the kind that settles in without needing proof, and that was what unsettled him most. Because if Keller had orchestrated what happened to Naomi, then everything that followed, her disappearance, her silence, the careful way she moved from place to place, it all pointed to one conclusion: she had known something important enough to walk away from everything rather than risk it being exposed. William closed the laptop slowly, the soft click echoing louder than it should have, and reached for his coat again, this time without hesitation. Because waiting was no longer an option. As he stepped out of the office and into the private elevator, the polished doors sliding shut in front of him, he caught one last glimpse of his reflection, composed, controlled, unchanged on the surface, but underneath, something had shifted, something irreversible. The elevator descended in silence, floor after floor, each one bringing him closer to a truth that was no longer distant, no longer abstract. And as the doors opened to the quiet hum of the underground garage, William Carter understood something with absolute clarity. Finding Naomi Brooks was not just about asking for forgiveness anymore, it was about uncovering a truth that someone else was already trying to keep buried, and if he was right about who that someone was, then the next time he saw Daniel Keller, it would not be as a partner, it would be as a man who had already started asking questions that could not be ignored. The engine of the car started with a low, controlled hum. But William Carter did not pull out of the garage immediately, his hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as the dim overhead lights cast long shadows across the concrete, because for the first time in years, he was not moving toward a deal, a meeting, or a calculated outcome. He was moving toward uncertainty, and that realization settled into him with a quiet intensity. The image Marcus Hale had sent lingered in his mind, Naomi standing outside that small community kitchen, sleeves rolled up, focused, present, unchanged in the ways that mattered and yet completely removed from the world he had built, and the more he thought about it, the clearer something became. She had not just left his company, she had left his entire world behind, deliberately, completely, as if there was nothing there worth returning to. William exhaled slowly and finally shifted the car into drive, the tires rolling forward with a smooth precision as he navigated the spiral ramp toward the street, the city opening up around him in layers of light and motion. But his focus remained fixed, not on the traffic, not on the skyline, but on the path ahead, because now every decision mattered in a way it had not before. His phone, resting in the center console, lit up again, another message from Hale, and William glanced at it briefly when he stopped at a red light, the word simple but sharp, location confirmed, Chicago, South Side, same building as the photo, she was seen there 2 days ago, and beneath it, a second line, she does not stay long. William's grip on the wheel tightened slightly, not out of urgency, but out of clarity, because that meant he had a window, a narrow one, but real. The light turned green, and he moved forward again, merging into the steady flow of traffic, his mind already calculating the fastest route, the earliest flight, the time it would take to reach her before she moved again. But beneath those calculations, something else pressed forward, quieter but stronger, the awareness that even if he found her, even if he stood in front of her after 5 years, there was no guarantee she would listen, no guarantee she would stay, and no certainty that anything he said would matter. The thought did not slow him down, but it shifted something deeper, because for so long, he had approached every situation with the expectation that there was always a solution, always a way to fix what was broken. But this was different. This was not a problem to solve, it was a consequence to face. His phone buzzed again, this time a call, and he answered without taking his eyes off the road. Hale, he said, anticipating the voice on the other end, but it was not Hale, it was someone else, someone he recognized instantly, Daniel Keller. William Keller's voice was smooth, composed, carrying the same controlled confidence it always had. I was told you postponed our meeting this morning. William did not respond right away, letting the silence stretch just enough to shift the balance of the conversation, before he said evenly, something more important came up. There was a brief pause, almost imperceptible, but it was there, and then Keller replied, I see. Well, I hope it is not related to any unnecessary concerns. We have a lot moving forward right now. The words were carefully chosen, neutral on the surface, but underneath, there was something else, something probing. William's gaze remained steady as he navigated a turn, the city lights reflecting off the windshield, and for a moment, he considered saying nothing, ending the call, continuing on without confrontation, but that was the version of himself that had made the wrong decision 5 years ago, the one who chose silence over truth. Tell me something, Daniel, William said, his voice calm but deliberate. Have you ever gone looking for someone who did not want to be found? The question hung in the air between them, unexpected, and on the other end, Keller did not answer immediately, the pause longer this time, heavier, and when he finally spoke, his tone had shifted, just slightly. That depends on why they are hiding. William's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly, because that was not a denial, it was an acknowledgement, indirect but clear enough, and in that moment, the uncertainty that had been forming began to take shape, sharper, More defined, "I guess we will find out," William replied quietly, before ending the call without another word, the line going silent as he accelerated onto the highway, the city beginning to fall away behind him. Ahead, the road stretched long and open, leading toward Chicago, toward Naomi, toward a truth that was no longer buried but waiting, and as the miles began to pass beneath him, William Carter understood something with absolute certainty. He was not just driving toward a reunion, he was driving into a confrontation that would demand more than an apology, more than an explanation. It would demand a choice, and this time, he would not look away. The flight to Chicago was quiet in a way that felt unfamiliar to William Carter, not because the private jet lacked comfort or noise, but because for the first time in years, his mind refused to settle into the usual rhythm of planning and control, instead replaying fragments of the past alongside the growing weight of what waited ahead. The cabin lights were dimmed, the city lights fading beneath the wing as the aircraft climbed, and William sat still, his hands folded loosely in front of him, staring at nothing in particular as Marcus Hale's latest update scrolled across his tablet. Timestamps, sightings, small confirmations that Naomi Brooks had been exactly where Hale said she was, helping, moving, disappearing before anyone could ask too many questions. It was not random, it was deliberate, and the more William studied it, the clearer the pattern became. She was not avoiding the world, she was avoiding being known within it, leaving just enough trace to help others but never enough to be held in place. The realization settled deeper when he noticed something else. The timing. Every appearance followed a crisis, a shortage of volunteers, a sudden need. As if Naomi did not arrive early, she arrived exactly when she was needed most, and then left before anyone could depend on her staying. William leaned back slightly, the leather seat cool against his shoulders, and exhaled slowly, because that was who she had always been. Even back then, focused not on recognition, but on impact, and somehow, he had been the one person who failed to see it. The aircraft leveled off, a soft chime echoing through the cabin, but his attention shifted when his phone vibrated again. A message from Hale marked priority, and when William opened it, the information was more precise than before. She is back at the location, confirmed within the last hour. Kitchen opens at 6 p.m., closes by 9. She has been seen entering through the side door. Beneath it, another note. There is increased activity around the area. Unfamiliar faces. Watching, William's expression tightened slightly, because that confirmed what he already suspected. He was not the only one closing in. He checked the time, did the math quickly, and realized he would land just after sunset, leaving him a narrow margin to reach her before she moved again. And this time, there would be no hesitation. As the jet began its descent, the city of Chicago came into view, stretching wide beneath a deepening sky, lights flickering on one by one like signals in the distance, and William felt something shift again. Not uncertainty, not doubt, but a steady, undeniable focus, because this was no longer about preparation, it was about action. The moment the aircraft touched down, he was already moving, stepping off the jet before the engines had fully powered down, his driver waiting at the base of the stairs, the car door open, ready, and within seconds, he was inside, the door closing with a soft, final sound that seemed to mark the transition from waiting to confrontation. South Side, William said, his voice calm but direct, and the driver nodded without question, pulling the car onto the road as the city moved around them, faster now, sharper, every turn bringing them closer to a place that felt both distant and immediate at the same time. The streets narrowed as they moved deeper into the neighborhood, the polished skyline fading behind them, replaced by something quieter, more grounded, and when the car finally slowed near the address Hale had provided, William did not step out right away. Instead, he looked through the window at the building across the street, modest, unremarkable at first glance, but alive in a different way. A soft glow from inside, silhouettes moving, people gathering. Not out of obligation, but out of need, and then he saw her, just for a moment, through the glass of the side entrance, Naomi Brooks, exactly where Hale said she would be, moving with the same steady focus he remembered, as if the last 5 years had not broken her, but reshaped her into something stronger, something quieter, something he did not yet understand. William's hand rested on the door handle, but he did not open it, not yet, because across the street, just beyond the edge of the light, he noticed something else, a dark SUV idling, its presence subtle but deliberate, and a figure inside, watching the same building, waiting just like he was, and in that moment, the truth settled fully into place. This was not just a reunion, this was a moment that someone else had been preparing for as well, and whatever happened next would not be as simple as walking through that door and saying her name. William Carter kept his hand on the door handle, but he did not move, not yet, because the reflection in the window showed him more than just his own hesitation. It showed the street behind him, the dim glow of the idling SUV across the way, and the subtle stillness of someone inside who was not there by accident. The city noise hummed softly around them, distant traffic, a faint siren somewhere far off, but here, in this narrow stretch of street, everything felt suspended, like time itself had slowed just enough to force a choice. His driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, waiting, but William simply said, "Stay here," his voice low, controlled, before finally pushing the door open and stepping out into the cool evening air. The moment his shoes touched the pavement, the world sharpened, the sounds clearer, the light from the building warmer, and for a brief second, he allowed himself to look again through the glass, to see her, Naomi, moving with quiet purpose, handing a tray to someone just inside the door, her expression focused, calm, unchanged in the way that mattered most, and something in his chest tightened, not from distance, but from recognition, because she had not been waiting for him, she had been living without him. He crossed the street slowly, not rushed, not hesitant, but deliberate, every step grounded in the awareness that this moment had taken 5 years to reach, and it would not be undone in a single sentence. As he approached the entrance, he felt it again, that subtle awareness of being watched, and without turning his head, he knew the SUV was still there, still waiting, its presence like a shadow just outside the light. His hand reached for the door, but before he opened it, he paused, just for a second, not out of fear but out of clarity, because once he stepped inside, everything would change, not just for him, but for her as well. The door opened with a soft chime, warm air spilling out to meet him, carrying the scent of food and quiet conversation, and as he stepped inside, the noise of the street faded behind him, replaced by something softer, something human, voices low, movements gentle, a space built on presence rather than power. For a moment, no one noticed him, and that gave him time to take in the room, the simple tables, the worn floors, the people gathered not out of obligation, but out of need, and at the center of it, Naomi, her back turned, speaking to someone just out of view, her tone calm, steady, as if the world outside did not exist. William took a step forward, then another, the distance between them closing slowly, and as if she felt it, as if something in the air shifted, Naomi stopped mid-motion, her hand stilling for just a fraction of a second before she turned. Their eyes met across the room, and everything else fell away, the voices, the movement, the space between them collapsing into a silence that did not need explanation. She did not look surprised, not in the way he expected. There was no shock, no confusion, only a quiet recognition, like she had always known this moment would come, just not when. William opened his mouth to speak, but the words did not come right away, because standing there, looking at her, he realized something he had not understood before. This was not a reunion, this was a confrontation with everything he had chosen not to see. Naomi's gaze held his for a long second, steady, unshaken, and then she said it, not loudly, not with anger, but with a clarity that cut deeper than anything else. "You found me," and William nodded slightly, his voice finally steady enough to answer, "Yes," but before he could say anything more, before he could explain, apologize, or even begin, her expression shifted just enough to change everything, not cold, not distant, but resolved, and she added quietly, "You were not supposed to," and in that moment, the meaning settled between them, heavy and undeniable, because this was never about whether he could find her, it was about whether he should have, and somewhere behind him, outside that door, the presence of the waiting SUV remained, silent, patient, reminding him that whatever came next was no longer just between the two of them. The words lingered in the air longer than they should have, quiet but immovable, and William Carter felt them settle somewhere deeper than any accusation ever could, because Naomi Brooks had not raised her voice, she had not stepped back, she had simply stated a truth that shifted the entire moment. "You were not supposed to," and for the first time since he walked into the room, he realized this was not about whether she recognized him, it was about what his presence meant now. The room around them continued to move, people talking softly, plates being passed, chairs shifting across the floor, but the space between them remained still, untouched by everything else, like the rest of the world had agreed to step aside for whatever came next. William took a slow breath, grounding himself in the moment, because every instinct he had built over years of control told him to speak, to explain, to take back the narrative. But something in her expression made him stop, not out of hesitation, but out of understanding, because this was not a conversation he could lead. Naomi held his gaze for a moment longer, then glanced past him, toward the door, toward the street beyond, and the shift was subtle, but unmistakable, her focus widening, calculating, as if she was measuring something he could not yet see. "You should not have come here," she said quietly, her voice steady, not emotional, not reactive, just certain. And William felt the weight of that statement settle in, not as rejection, but as warning. "I did not come to make this harder," he replied, his tone measured, careful, because the last thing he wanted was to repeat the mistake of speaking without understanding. "I came because I finally know what happened." The words were simple, but they carried everything he had spent 5 years trying to reach, and for a brief second, something shifted in her eyes, not surprise, not relief, but something closer to recognition, as if she had expected that eventually, he would arrive at the truth. But whatever that moment was, it passed quickly, replaced by the same quiet resolve. "Knowing is not the same as understanding," she said. And the distinction landed between them with a clarity that left no room for argument. William stepped closer, lowering his voice, aware now of the people around them, aware that this was not just their moment. "Then help me understand," he said, and for the first time, there was a pause in her response, not hesitation, but consideration, as if she was weighing something far more complex than his words alone. Her gaze shifted again, briefly, toward the door, and this time William followed it. Just enough to see the faint outline of movement outside, the reflection of headlights against the glass, the presence he had noticed before still there, still waiting. When she looked back at him, there was something different now, not distance, not anger, but a quiet urgency that had not been there before. "You think this is about what you did," she said softly, her voice low enough that no one else could hear, "but it stopped being about you a long time ago." The word settled into him with a weight that shifted everything, because they reframed the entire search, the entire journey, from something personal to something larger, something he had not yet seen. "Then what is it about?" he asked, and this time, Naomi did not answer right away, her eyes holding his for a long second before she finally said, "It is about what happens if the truth comes out." And in that moment, William understood something he had not allowed himself to consider before. This was not just about clearing her name, it was about protecting something, or someone, from the consequences of that truth. A chair scraped softly across the floor somewhere behind them, a voice called out for assistance, and Naomi stepped back slightly, the movement small but intentional, creating just enough distance to remind him that this conversation existed within a larger reality, one that did not pause for their history. "You need to leave," she said, not as a request, but as a decision, and when William did not move immediately, she added, more quietly this time, "If you stay, they will know you found me." The implication was clear, immediate, and undeniable, because whoever was watching, whoever was waiting outside, they were not just observing, they were calculating, just like she was. William glanced once more toward the door, the faint silhouette of the SUV still present in the reflection, and then back at Naomi, the realization settling in with a sharp clarity. This was no longer a question of whether he could talk to her, it was a question of whether his presence would put her in danger, not in the way he had imagined 5 years ago, but in a way that was far more controlled, far more deliberate. "Come with me," he said, the words leaving him before he could reconsider them, but Naomi shook her head almost immediately, a small, decisive movement that carried more certainty than any explanation. "I am exactly where I need to be," she replied, and as the silence returned between them, heavier now, more urgent, William understood that finding her had not brought him closer to fixing anything. It had placed him directly in the middle of something that had never stopped unfolding. Something that had been waiting, quietly, for him to arrive. William Carter did not move when she told him to leave, not because he did not understand, but because something in the way Naomi Brooks said it made him realize that leaving would not solve anything anymore. It would only delay what had already begun. The quiet hum of the room continued around them. Someone laughed softly at a table near the back. A chair shifted, a plate was set down, but between them, the silence held firm. Filled with everything that had not yet been said, William lowered his voice, careful, controlled. "If they already know I am here, then leaving will not change that," and Naomi's eyes sharpened slightly, not in disagreement, but in acknowledgement of the risk he had just stepped into. She glanced again toward the door, then back at him, measuring, calculating, and for the first time, he saw something beneath the calm, not fear, but pressure, the kind that comes from carrying something too important to let slip. You do not understand how this works, she said quietly, and the words were not dismissive, they were precise. As if she was trying to explain something he had never had to learn. Then tell me. William replied, his tone steady, not demanding, but firm, because this was the moment he had been moving toward, not just finding her, but hearing what he had refused to hear before. Naomi held his gaze for a second longer, then exhaled softly, the smallest shift in her posture suggesting that she was making a decision she had avoided for years. 5 years ago, she began, her voice low, controlled. You thought you were choosing the safest option. Protecting your company, protecting your reputation. William's jaw tightened slightly, but he did not interrupt. Not this time. But what you did was remove the one person who knew what was really happening. The words landed with a clarity that made everything else in the room feel distant. William felt it immediately, not as a surprise, but as confirmation of something he had already begun to suspect. Keller, he said quietly, and Naomi's expression did not change. But the silence that followed was answer enough. He was not acting alone, she added, and that was the piece that shifted everything again, because it expanded the scope beyond a single betrayal, beyond one decision, into something larger, something structured, something deliberate. William took a slow breath, processing it, his mind moving through the implications faster than he could speak them. Then why disappear? He asked. Why not come forward? And this time, Naomi's response came without hesitation. Because coming forward would not have exposed him, it would have exposed everything connected to him, she said, and her eyes flicked once more toward the door, toward the street, and some of those things were not mine to risk. The meaning settled heavily between them, because this was no longer just about her name, her career, her life. It was about something she had chosen to protect, something she had valued more than clearing herself, and William felt the weight of that choice press against his own, the decision he had made in that office years ago, the one that had cost her everything without him ever understanding what she was carrying. So you stayed silent, he said, and Naomi nodded once. A small, deliberate motion. I stayed out of reach, she corrected, and the distinction mattered, because silence implied absence, but she had not been absent, she had been present in a different way, in places that mattered, for people who needed her, just not in the world he controlled. The sound of a car engine shifting outside drew both of their attention for a brief moment, subtle, but enough to remind them that time was not on their side, that whatever this moment was, it was not happening in isolation. They are watching, Naomi said quietly, her voice steady but urgent now, and if they think you are here because of me, they will not wait. William followed her gaze again, catching the faint movement through the glass, the outline of the SUV still there, still patient, and something inside him shifted from uncertainty to decision. Then we stop waiting, he said, the words leaving him with a clarity that surprised even him, because this was no longer about reacting. It was about choosing, and for the first time in 5 years, he was not choosing what was safe, he was choosing what was right. Naomi looked at him carefully, searching for something in his expression, something that had not been there before, and whatever she saw, it made her pause, just long enough to consider the possibility that this moment could lead somewhere different. You think you can fix this, she said, not as a question, but as an observation, and William shook his head slightly, his voice quieter now, but stronger. No, I think I can stop pretending it does not exist. And as the words settled between them, the distance that had defined the last 5 years shifted, not closing, not yet, but changing, because for the first time, they were no longer standing on opposite sides of the same mistake, they were standing at the edge of the same truth, and outside, the presence of the waiting car remained, no longer just a shadow, but a signal that whatever came next would not stay contained for long. The shift was subtle at first, not in the room, not in Naomi's expression, but in the air itself, like something unseen had moved closer, and William Carter felt it before he saw it, the faint reflection of headlights growing brighter against the glass door, the low rumble of an engine no longer idling but repositioning, deliberate, patient. Naomi noticed it too, her posture tightening just slightly, her eyes flicking toward the entrance again. And this time, she did not hide the urgency in her voice. It is happening sooner than I thought, she said quietly, and William turned fully toward the door, his focus narrowing, because whatever had been waiting outside was no longer just observing, it was preparing. Who exactly are we dealing with? He asked, his voice low but steady, and Naomi did not answer right away, not because she did not know, but because the answer carried weight, consequence, something that could not be taken back once spoken. Instead, she stepped closer, lowering Her voice even further. "You already said his name," she replied, and the confirmation landed without surprise, only clarity, because Daniel Keller was no longer a suspicion, he was a certainty. William exhaled slowly, his mind moving quickly through the implications. Every deal, every partnership, every quiet decision Keller had influenced, all of it shifting into a new shape, one that no longer looked like trust but control. Outside, a car door opened, the sound muted but unmistakable, and both of them heard it, the moment stretching thin as the distance between action and consequence began to close. Naomi's gaze locked onto William's again, sharper now, more direct. "If you stay, you cannot pretend you do not see it anymore," she said, and this time, there was no warning in her tone, only truth. William did not look away. "I stopped pretending the moment I walked in," he replied, and the words held, steady, unshaken, because this was no longer about hesitation, it was about choice. Naomi studied him for a second longer, searching for any sign that he might step back, that he might retreat into the version of himself that had failed her before, but whatever she saw in his expression, it was enough to shift something, not trust, not yet, but a willingness to move forward. "Then listen carefully," she said, her voice controlled but urgent. "Keller is not just protecting himself, he is protecting a network. People who benefit from information staying hidden, people who do not need attention to maintain power." William nodded slightly, absorbing it, because it fit too well, too cleanly with everything he had started to uncover. "And you think I can expose that?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as a clarification, and Naomi shook her head once. "No, I think you can disrupt it, and that is what makes you dangerous now." The word dangerous settled differently than anything else she had said. Not as a threat, but as a shift in position, because for the first time, William was no longer outside of this, he was part of it. Footsteps approached the door, slow, measured, and the handle moved slightly, just enough to signal that whoever was outside had made their decision. Naomi stepped back half a pace, creating space, not distance, but readiness, her eyes still on William. "When that door opens, you do not speak for me," she said quietly. And he understood immediately, because this was not his story to control. Not anymore. The door opened with a soft chime, and a man stepped inside, well-dressed, composed, his presence blending easily into the room, but his attention fixed, direct, scanning until it landed exactly where it was meant to, on Naomi, then on William. For a moment, nothing was said, but the silence carried more than enough, recognition, calculation, and something else beneath it, expectation. The man took a few steps forward, his voice calm, almost conversational. "I was wondering how long it would take," he said, and though he did not say the name, he did not need to, because the meaning was already clear. William straightened slightly, his posture unchanged. But his focus sharpened, because this was no longer a distant problem, it was standing in front of him, speaking in a voice that sounded controlled, reasonable, even polite, and that made it more dangerous than anything else. Naomi did not respond right away, her silence deliberate, her presence steady, and when she finally spoke, her words were simple, but they shifted the balance instantly. "You should not have followed him," she said. And the man's expression did not change, but his eyes flicked briefly toward William, then back to her, and in that small movement, everything aligned, the search, the waiting car, the timing of this moment, it had all been part of the same design. William felt the weight of it settle fully now, not as uncertainty, but as clarity, because there was no turning this back into something smaller, something contained. This had already moved beyond that, and as the silence stretched once more, filled with everything that had yet to be said, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was the moment where everything that had been hidden for 5 years was finally beginning to surface, and none of them were walking away from it unchanged. The man did not rush forward, did not raise his voice, did not do anything that would draw attention from the others in the room, and that was what made his presence feel so controlled, so intentional, as if he had stepped into this moment long before any of them realized it had begun. His eyes moved briefly across the space, acknowledging the people nearby without truly seeing them, before settling again on Naomi Brooks, then on William Carter, measuring, calculating, as though he already knew exactly how this would unfold. "You always did have a way of finding complications," he said calmly, his tone directed at William but layered with something else, something that suggested familiarity beyond what had ever been spoken aloud. William held his ground, his posture steady, his expression unreadable, because this was not a negotiation. "Not yet. You followed me," he replied, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact, and the man allowed a faint, almost amused smile to surface. No, he said. Evenly, I followed the pattern, you just happened to fit into it. Naomi remained still, her presence quiet but firm between them, and when she spoke, her voice carried a precision that cut through the tension without raising it. You should not be here, she said, and the man's attention shifted fully to her now, his expression softening just enough to suggest something that almost resembled respect. On the contrary, he answered, this is exactly where I need to be. The room continued to move around them, unaware of the weight of the exchange unfolding just a few feet away, and William felt the contrast sharply, the normalcy of the space against the quiet gravity of what was happening, because this was not loud, not dramatic, but it carried more consequence than anything he had faced in years. You framed her, William said, his voice low, controlled, the words landing without hesitation, and for the first time, the man's expression shifted, not dramatically, not enough to draw attention, but just enough to acknowledge that the conversation had moved beyond surface-level exchanges. You make it sound so simple, he replied, his tone still calm, still measured, but simplicity is rarely accurate. Naomi's eyes did not leave his, her posture unchanged. Then explain it, she said, and there was no emotion in her voice, only expectation, because she was not asking for an excuse, she was asking for truth. The man paused for a moment, considering, as if deciding how much to reveal, and then he spoke again, quieter this time. What happened 5 years ago was not about you, Naomi. It was about continuity, about ensuring that certain systems remained undisturbed. The word lingered, carefully chosen, and William felt the implication settle in immediately, because this was not about a single act, it was about maintaining something larger, something structured, and removing her was part of that. William said, and the man inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the point without confirming it directly. She was in a position to ask the wrong questions, he replied, questions that would have led to answers that were not meant to surface. Naomi's expression did not change, but her voice sharpened just enough to carry weight. So you removed the question, she said, and this time, the man's silence was the answer. William felt something shift inside him then, not anger, not shock, but clarity, because this was no longer speculation, it was confirmation of everything he had begun to uncover, everything he had chosen not to see before. You built your success on that system, the man continued, his gaze returning to William, whether you realized it or not, and the words landed with a precision that made them impossible to ignore, because they reframed not just the past, but the present, the entire foundation of what William had built. For a moment, the silence returned, heavier now, filled with the weight of truth rather than uncertainty, and Naomi stepped forward slightly, her voice steady, unshaken. And now you are here to make sure it stays that way, she said, and the man's expression softened again. That same faint hint of something almost respectful. No, he replied, I am here to make sure it does not unravel. William exhaled slowly, the reality of it settling fully into place, because this was not about protecting a single person, it was about preserving an entire structure that depended on silence, on control, on decisions made without question. It already is, William said quietly, and the certainty in his voice shifted something in the room, subtle but undeniable, because for the first time, he was not speaking from assumption, he was speaking from understanding. The man studied him for a moment, longer this time, as if reassessing, recalculating, and then he said, that depends on what you choose to do next, and the words carried more weight than anything else he had said, because they placed the outcome not in the past, not in Naomi's silence, but in William's hands. Naomi's gaze moved between them, the tension no longer hidden but defined, and in that moment, the truth became unavoidable. This was no longer about uncovering what had happened, it was about deciding what would happen next, and whatever choice William made, it would not just affect him, it would determine whether everything that had been hidden for 5 years would finally come to light or disappear again, this time for good. The room did not change, not in any visible way, but something within it shifted, like a quiet line had been crossed and there was no returning to the moment before it, and William Carter felt that shift settle into him with a clarity that removed any remaining distance between what he had been and what he now understood. The man standing in front of him remained composed, unshaken, his presence controlled as ever, but the balance had moved subtly, almost imperceptibly, because the truth was no longer hidden, it was spoken, and that alone had altered everything. William did not look away as he answered, his voice steady, grounded in something deeper than confidence. Then I choose not to protect it. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of every decision he had made before this one. Every moment he had chosen convenience over truth, and the difference now was not in the words themselves, but in the fact that he meant them without hesitation. The man studied him carefully, his expression unreadable for a moment longer than before, as if recalculating a situation that no longer followed the expected pattern, and when he spoke again, his tone remained calm, but something beneath it had shifted. "You are underestimating what that choice requires," he said, not as a warning, but as a statement of fact, and William inclined his head slightly, acknowledging it without stepping back, because for the first time, he was not trying to reduce the cost, he was accepting it. Naomi Brooks stood between them, her presence quiet but unyielding, and though she had said very little, the weight of her silence carried as much meaning as anything spoken, because she was not waiting for William to prove himself with words, she was watching to see if he would stand when it mattered. "It is not just your reputation," the man continued, his gaze steady on William, "it is your entire structure, your partnerships, your influence, everything that has been built on top of what you are now questioning." And the truth of that was undeniable, because William could see it now, the interconnected decisions, the quiet approvals, the moments he had trusted the system without examining what it was built on. "Then it should not stand," William replied, and the conviction in his voice did not rise, did not sharpen, it remained level, controlled, and that made it stronger, because it was not reaction, it was decision. Naomi's eye shifted slightly toward him, just enough to register that something real had changed. Not in what he said, but in how he said it, because there was no hesitation left, no room for retreat. The man's gaze moved between them, assessing, weighing, and for a moment, the silence stretched long enough to feel like a test, one that had already begun and could not be paused. "You believe this will end with exposure," he said finally, his tone thoughtful, almost reflective, "but systems like this do not collapse, they adapt," and the implication was clear, that whatever William chose to do, it would not simply dismantle what had been built, it would trigger something else, something less visible, less predictable. William absorbed that without flinching, because the outcome was no longer the question, the choice was, and he had already made it. "Then it will adapt without me," he said quietly, and for the first time, the man's expression shifted in a way that could not be mistaken, not surprise, not concern, but recognition, as if he was seeing William not as he had been, but as he was becoming. Naomi took a slow breath, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, but there was something different now, not trust, not forgiveness, but a shift in alignment, subtle, but real, because this was no longer a conversation about the past, it was about what they were willing to do with it. Outside, the faint hum of the car engine remained, a reminder that the world beyond this room had not stopped, that whatever decision was made here would move beyond these walls almost immediately. The man glanced briefly toward the door, then back at William. "If you move forward with this, there will be consequences you cannot control," he said, and William nodded once, a small, deliberate motion that carried more weight than any declaration, because control was no longer the objective. "I know," he replied, and the simplicity of that answer settled into the space between them, closing the distance between understanding and action. Naomi looked at him for a moment longer, her expression unreadable, and then she spoke, not to challenge him, not to question him, but to mark the reality of what came next. "Then you do not get to walk away from it halfway," she said, and William met her gaze without hesitation. "I will not," he answered, and in that exchange, something shifted again, not resolved, not complete, but defined, because whatever this moment was, it was no longer uncertain, it was set in motion. The man took a small step back, not retreating, but acknowledging the change, his voice returning to its earlier calm. "Then we will see how far you are willing to go," he said, and as the words settled into the room, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer a hidden conflict waiting to be discovered, it was an open path that demanded action, and for the first time in 5 years, William Carter was no longer searching for the past, he was stepping directly into the consequences of it. For a moment, no one moved, not William Carter, not Naomi Brooks, not even the man who had just stepped back as if acknowledging a shift that could no longer be reversed, and yet everything in the room felt different, as if an invisible line had been crossed and the space itself understood that what came next would not stay contained within these walls. The quiet sounds of the kitchen continued around them, a plate placed gently on a table, a soft thank you exchanged between strangers, the ordinary rhythm of people helping one another, and that contrast pressed against William's awareness in a way he could not ignore, because this place, This small, unassuming room represented everything he had failed to protect 5 years ago, something real, something human, something that did not belong to systems or control. Naomi stood steady, her gaze fixed on him, not searching for promises, not waiting for reassurance, but measuring whether the decision he had just made would hold once. It left this moment, because words had never been the problem, it was what followed them that mattered. William met her eyes without hesitation, and for the first time since he had found her, there was no distance left in his expression, no trace of the man who had chosen silence over truth, only the quiet certainty of someone who understood the cost and had accepted it. "This does not end here," Naomi said softly, not as a warning, but as a statement of reality, and William nodded once, because he knew that better than anyone. Now, this was not a resolution, it was a beginning. The man near the door adjusted his stance slightly, his presence still calm, still controlled, but no longer hidden, as if the need for subtlety had passed, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the same measured tone. "You have made your position clear," he said, "but clarity does not protect you from consequence," and William did not respond immediately, not because he lacked an answer, but because he no longer felt the need to defend the choice he had already made. Instead, he turned slightly toward Naomi, lowering his voice just enough that the words belonged only to her. "Whatever this becomes, you will not face it alone." The sentence was simple, but it carried more weight than any apology he could have offered, because it was not about the past, it was about what he was choosing now. And Naomi held his gaze, her expression unchanged for a long second, and then, almost imperceptibly, something shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the absence of resistance, the smallest opening where there had been none before, and she replied quietly, "Then do not make the mistake of thinking this is something you can control." And William gave the slightest nod, because that lesson had already been learned. Outside, the faint glow of headlights shifted again, the SUV still present, still waiting, but no longer the only force in motion, because something larger had been set into motion here, something that would extend far beyond this street, this city, this moment. The man by the door stepped back once more, not retreating, but repositioning, his attention moving between them with a final, assessing look, as if committing this version of them to memory, before he turned slightly toward the exit. "We will be in touch," he said, and the words carried an inevitability that made them feel less like a threat and more like a certainty, because this was not over, it had only just begun. The door opened again with that same soft chime, and as he stepped out into the night, the room seemed to exhale, the tension easing just enough for the sounds of normal life to return. But William knew that nothing about this was normal anymore, and Naomi stepped back, creating space, her attention returning briefly to the people around her, to the work she had never abandoned, and in that moment, he understood something that had taken him 5 years to see clearly. She had not been waiting for redemption, she had been living with truth, carrying it quietly, deliberately. While he had been searching for a way to catch up, he took a step back as well, not leaving, not yet, but giving the moment room to settle, because this was not about holding on to her presence, it was about respecting the life she had built without him. "I will find the rest of it," he said finally, his voice steady, not asking for permission, not expecting approval, just stating what he intended to do. And Naomi glanced at him once more, her expression calm, grounded. "You already found the hardest part," she replied, "now you have to decide what you are willing to lose to keep it." And the word stayed with him as the silence returned, heavier now, but clearer, because there was no confusion left about what came next. William Carter stood there for a moment longer, taking in the room, the light, the quiet strength of the place she had chosen, and then he turned toward the door, stepping back into the night, not as the man who had come searching, but as someone who finally understood what the search required. And as the cool air met him outside, the city stretching wide in front of him, one truth settled in with absolute certainty: finding Naomi Brooks had not given him closure, it had given him a choice, and this time, walking away was no longer one of the options.